My husband Simon stood up at the annual gala, champagne glass raised, and told 300 people that my job was basically professional coffee fetching with a fancy title. Everyone laughed. His boss laughed. The CFO laughed. Simon grinned and said I should be grateful he explained business concepts to me at home, otherwise I'd be completely lost in the corporate world. He patted my hand. Don't worry, honey, not everyone can handle real responsibility. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I smiled. Nodded. Sipped my wine. What Simon didn't know was that I'd sat in a boardroom exactly 1 week earlier and reviewed his department's annual budget proposal. The one requesting $500,000 for his flagship project. The one I could approve or deny with a single signature. I approved it. And tomorrow morning, I was going to revoke it. I'm standing at table 12 in a floor-length navy dress I bought specifically because Simon said it made me look appropriately professional but not attention-seeking. The grand ballroom of the Ashford Hotel is packed with exactly the kind of people Simon loves impressing: executives from Meridian Industries, board members from partner organizations, donors whose names appear on hospital wings and university libraries. Simon's had 4 glasses of champagne. I can always tell because his voice gets louder and his jokes get meaner, but in that plausibly deniable way where he can later claim he was just being playful. His hand is on my shoulder now, keeping me positioned next to him like a prop in his performance of successful corporate masculinity. I want to thank my beautiful wife, Evelyn, he's saying, and I can hear the subtle condescension already creeping into his tone. She's been so supportive of my work, even though she doesn't really understand what I do. Her job is in, what do you call it, honey? Administrative operations? I'm the Director of Strategic Resource Allocation for the Thornton Foundation. We manage $2.3 billion in grant funding across technology, healthcare, and education initiatives. But Simon has spent 3 years of our marriage referring to my position as that admin thing, or your office job, because acknowledging what I actually do would require acknowledging that I might be more qualified than he is. She makes sure people have the right paperwork, Simon continues, warming to his theme now. The table is smiling indulgently. His department head, Martin Arquette, is chuckling. The woman to my left, I think she's from investor relations, has her hand over her mouth in that way that's supposed to look polite but really just signals she's enjoying watching someone else get subtly demolished. Very important work, obviously. Someone has to make sure the forms are filled out correctly. Forms. He thinks I process forms. Last Tuesday, I sat in conference room 4B at the Thornton Foundation headquarters with 10 other committee members and reviewed Simon's department's annual funding proposal. Meridian Industries had applied for a $500,000 grant to develop what they called a revolutionary supply chain optimization platform. The proposal had Simon's name on it as project director. His signature was on every page. I'd read the entire 80-page document the night before while Simon was at a work dinner he hadn't invited me to. The proposal was adequate. Not brilliant, but solid enough to merit funding based on our established criteria. The technology was sound, the budget breakdown was reasonable, and Meridian's track record suggested they could actually execute what they were promising. So I'd voted to approve it. The other 10 committee members had agreed. The $500,000 would hit Meridian's accounts within 30 days, and Simon's project, the one he'd been obsessing over for 8 months, would finally move forward. He has no idea I was in that room. No idea I read every word of his proposal. No idea that my signature appears on the approval documentation currently sitting in Meridian's legal department. The thing about Evelyn's job, Simon is saying now, his voice carrying across our table and starting to attract attention from neighboring tables, is that it's perfect for her. No real pressure, no major decisions, just making sure things run smoothly in the background. Not everyone can handle high-stakes corporate strategy. Some people are just better suited for support roles. Support roles. I've approved $47 million in grants this year alone. I've killed projects from organizations 10 times larger than Meridian because their proposals didn't meet our standards. I've sat across from CEOs and university presidents and told them their million-dollar requests were denied because they couldn't demonstrate measurable impact. But Simon thinks I file paperwork. The woman from investor relations is fully laughing now. Martin is nodding like Simon just said something profound about recognizing people's natural abilities. Someone at the next table has turned to watch, drawn in by Simon's performance. "Honey," Simon says, squeezing my shoulder in that proprietary way he's developed, "you're not upset, are you? You know I'm just being honest. There's no shame in having a simpler career path. Not everyone needs to be in the boardroom making million-dollar decisions." I smile at him. The same smile I've been perfecting for 3 years. The smile that says I'm not threatening, not complicated, not someone who needs to be taken seriously. "You're right," I say quietly. Not everyone can handle that kind of responsibility. Tomorrow morning, I'm calling an emergency review of Meridian's approved grants. And Simon's $500,000 is about to disappear. I met Simon at a conference in Boston. One of those massive corporate events where everyone wears the same badge and pretends networking is enjoyable instead of exhausting. I was presenting a panel on innovative funding models for tech startups. He was in the audience, sitting third row, actually taking notes. Afterward, he'd approached me with intelligent questions about scalability and risk assessment. He worked for Meridian Industries in their supply chain division, a mid-level analyst position, he'd said, but he had ambitions. He wanted to move into project management, eventually lead major initiatives. He was charming in that specific way that makes you feel like you're the only person in a crowded room. We dated for 8 months before he proposed. During that time, I was finishing my transition into the director role at Thornton Foundation. It was a promotion that came with substantial responsibility. I'd moved from managing a small regional portfolio to overseeing strategic allocation across the entire Northeast corridor. My budget authority had increased from $12 million to over $200 million annually. I'd told Simon about the promotion, obviously. We'd celebrated with dinner at that Italian place he loved in the North End. But when I tried to explain what the role actually entailed, the committee work, the strategic planning, the level of due diligence required for major grant decisions, his eyes had glazed over in that particular way that meant he was waiting for his turn to talk about his own career. "That's amazing, Ev," he'd said, reaching across the table for my hand. "I'm so proud of you. My girlfriend, moving up in the foundation world." Foundation world. Like it was some quaint separate universe from real business. The engagement happened 2 months later. His proposal was elaborate, rooftop restaurant, photographer hiding behind a pillar, the whole performance. I'd said yes because I loved him, or because I thought I did, or because at 31 I was tired of my mother asking when I was going to settle down, like my younger sister already had. The wedding was smaller than Simon wanted but larger than I preferred. His parents paid for most of it, which his mother reminded me of approximately 40 times during the planning process. My parents contributed what they could. They were both retired teachers living on fixed income, but the financial imbalance became another thing Simon's mother could hold over me with her tight smiles and comments about different backgrounds. I should have noticed the warning signs during wedding planning. The way Simon made decisions without consulting me, then framed it as taking care of things so you don't have to worry. The way he introduced me at engagement parties as my fiancée Evelyn, she works in administration, without ever mentioning the director title or what I actually did. The way he'd talk over me when I tried to contribute to conversations about business or strategy, then later explained that he was just trying to keep things simple for people who aren't familiar with corporate structures. But I was busy. The Thornton Foundation was expanding its portfolio into healthcare technology grants, and I was leading the strategic assessment. I was working 60-hour weeks, reviewing proposals, conducting site visits, building relationships with research institutions and startup accelerators. I assumed Simon understood how demanding my work was, even if he didn't ask many questions about it. The first year of marriage was when the pattern really solidified. Simon got promoted to senior analyst, then to project coordinator. Each promotion came with celebrations where he'd gather our friends and his colleagues and talk about his trajectory, his strategy, his vision for where he was heading. When people politely asked what I did, Simon would jump in before I could answer. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Evelyn works for a foundation. Grants and paperwork, mostly. Very detail-oriented work. Grants and paperwork. Like I was a clerk processing applications instead of someone making strategic decisions about millions of dollars in funding. I started correcting him at first. Actually, I'm the Director of Strategic Resource Allocation. I oversee the committee that determines. Right, he'd interrupt, smiling like I was being pedantic. She's very good at the organizational side of things. Very thorough. After a while, I stopped correcting him. It was easier to let people assume whatever they wanted to assume. And honestly, I started to realize there was a certain strategic advantage to being underestimated. When you're overlooked, people don't guard their words around you. They don't think about what you might understand or what you might remember. At Meridian corporate events, I became the wife who smiled politely while the real players talked business. Simon's colleagues would discuss projects and budgets and departmental politics like I wasn't even there. Martin Arquette, Simon's department head, once spent 20 minutes at a holiday party explaining supply chain logistics to me like I was a child learning about how products get to stores, never once asking if I might already understand concepts like just-in-time inventory or demand forecasting. I let him explain. I asked simple questions. I presented myself as unthreatening and pleasant. And I learned everything about how Meridian operated, what their priorities were, and exactly where their vulnerabilities lived. The moment everything changed happened on a Wednesday morning in March. I was in my office at Thornton Foundation headquarters, reviewing the quarterly pipeline report, when my assistant David knocked on the door with an expression I'd learned to recognize as, "You're going to see this immediately." "We just received a major application from Meridian Industries," he said, handing me the folder. "They're requesting $500,000 for a supply chain technology project. Timeline is aggressive. They want approval within 60 days. I opened the folder and saw Simon's name on the cover page. Project Director, Simon Green. For a moment, I just stared at it. My husband had applied for a grant from my foundation. $500,000. And he'd never mentioned it to me. Not once. I flipped through the executive summary. The project was actually impressive. A machine learning platform designed to optimize inventory management across multiple distribution centers. The technology was solid, the market research was thorough, and the budget breakdown showed someone had done their homework. This wasn't some rushed proposal. This was months of work. "Did they know you'd be reviewing this?" David asked carefully. He was one of the few people at Thornton who knew Simon worked for Meridian, though he'd never met him. "I don't think Simon knows what I actually do here," I said, hearing the bitterness in my own voice. "He thinks I process paperwork." David was quiet for a moment. "So what do you want to do with it?" That was the question, wasn't it? I could recuse myself from the review process, hand it off to another director, avoid the conflict of interest entirely. That would be the clean, professional thing to do. But as I read through Simon's proposal, seeing his signature on every approval page, his name in every project milestone, something else occurred to me. This was leverage. I called our legal counsel that afternoon. Her name was May Simmons, and she'd been with Thornton for 15 years. She'd seen every possible complication in grant management. "I need to understand the ethics here," I told her, laying out the situation. "My husband's company applied for funding. I'm on the review committee. What are my obligations?" May was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Legally, you need to disclose the relationship to the committee. They can decide whether you should recuse yourself or not." "But Evelyn, can I ask you something off the record?" "Of course. Does your husband know you're in a position to approve or deny this grant?" "No. He has no idea." May's laugh was short and sharp. "Then you have a bigger problem than ethics compliance. You have a husband who fundamentally doesn't understand what you do for a living." She wasn't wrong. That evening, I went home and waited for Simon to mention the grant application. We had dinner together, takeout Thai food eaten at the kitchen counter because Simon said he was too tired to go out. He talked about his day, about Martin pushing back on some timeline, about office politics and who was angling for the next promotion. I waited for him to mention the grant proposal. The biggest project of his career. The $500,000 that could make or break his trajectory at Meridian. He never said a word. "How was your day?" he asked, finally, after he'd exhausted every detail of his own. "Busy," I said. "Reviewed some new applications." He responded, already pulling out his phone to check email. "Paperwork stuff?" "Paperwork stuff." His $500,000 future was sitting on my desk, and he thought I was filing forms. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay next to Simon in our bed, listening to him breathe, and realized I'd been living with a stranger. Not because he'd been hiding who he was, but because he'd never bothered to learn who I was. 3 years of marriage, and he'd never once asked substantive questions about my work. Never wondered what strategic resource allocation actually meant. Never been curious about what I did in those committee meetings or why I sometimes came home exhausted from decisions that felt impossible. He'd built an entire image of me in his head, the supportive wife with the admin job, and that image was so comfortable for him that he'd never looked hard enough to see it wasn't real. I made a decision that night. I would review his proposal fairly, according to the same standards I applied to every other application. If it was good enough, I'd vote to approve it. If it wasn't, I'd vote to deny it. But either way, I would disclose my relationship to the committee and let them decide how to handle the conflict of interest. What I wouldn't do was tell Simon. Not yet. I wanted to see how long it would take for him to mention his career-defining project to his wife. I wanted to see if he'd ask for my advice, or my perspective, or even just acknowledge that I might have relevant expertise in grant funding. The proposal sat in Thornton's system for 4 days before Simon finally brought it up. We were getting ready for bed, and he mentioned, almost casually, that Meridian had submitted some big funding request to some foundation. Some foundation, I repeated. Yeah, I don't remember the name. One of those nonprofit grant places. Martin thinks we have a good shot, but you know how those things are. Probably comes down to who knows who on the board. Who knows who on the board? I smiled in the dark. Probably, I said. The committee meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks later. I had 21 days to decide exactly how I wanted to play this. I disclosed the conflict of interest to the committee the morning before our review session. I sent a formal email to all 10 other members, explaining that my husband was the project director on the Meridian Industries application and offering to recuse myself from the discussion and vote entirely. The responses came back within hours. Most of them said the same thing: stay on the committee, participate in discussion, but abstain from the final vote if I felt it was necessary. Our chair, a woman named Savannah Powell who'd been doing grant management longer than I'd been alive, called me directly. "Evelyn, I've read the Meridian proposal," she said. "It's solid work. Your husband might actually be good at his job, regardless of how he treats yours." I hadn't told Savannah how Simon dismissed my career, but apparently it was obvious enough that she'd picked up on it from our previous conversations about work-life balance. "I want to evaluate it fairly," I said. "Then evaluate it fairly. Give us your professional assessment. We're all adults here. We can separate your expertise from your personal relationships." The committee meeting happened on a Tuesday afternoon. We gathered in conference room 4B, the one with the long mahogany table and the windows overlooking the city. 11 of us total, each responsible for different aspects of due diligence. Technology assessment, financial review, organizational capacity, strategic alignment with foundation priorities. I'd prepared a 20-page analysis of the Meridian proposal. I knew it better than anyone else in that room because I'd spent 3 weeks reading it obsessively, cross-referencing every claim, verifying every statistic, checking every assumption against industry benchmarks. When we got to the Meridian application in our queue, Savannah asked me to present the overview since I'd done the primary review. Meridian Industries is requesting $500,000 over 18 months, I began, pulling up the presentation I'd prepared. The project proposes developing a machine learning platform for supply chain optimization. The technology is sound, they're using established frameworks, not trying to reinvent fundamental algorithms. The team has relevant experience. The budget is reasonable, even conservative in some areas. I walked them through every section. Market analysis. Technical specifications. Implementation timeline. Risk mitigation strategies. I presented it exactly the way I'd present any other proposal, professionally, thoroughly, without emotion or bias. The main weakness, I continued, is in the sustainability planning. The proposal doesn't adequately address what happens after the grant period ends. How does Meridian plan to maintain and scale this platform without ongoing external funding? That's a gap that would need to be addressed. Jacob Powell, who handled financial reviews, nodded. I saw that too. The revenue projections are optimistic, but they don't show a clear path to self-sufficiency. We discussed it for 40 minutes. Every committee member weighed in. The consensus emerged naturally. The project was strong enough to fund, but we'd need to add conditions. Meridian would have to provide quarterly sustainability updates and demonstrate progress toward financial independence by month 12. When Savannah called for a vote, I abstained as planned. The other 10 members voted unanimously to approve with conditions. $500,000 to Meridian Industries. Simon's project was funded. I went home that evening and waited to see if he'd tell me. We had dinner together, pasta I'd made over the weekend and reheated. Simon was distracted, checking his phone every few minutes. You seem preoccupied, I said. Just waiting to hear about something at work. Big funding decision that should come through any day now. What kind of funding? He waved his hand vaguely. Grant thing. Complicated. Probably boring for you. Boring for me. I'd spent 3 weeks analyzing every detail of his proposal and 4 hours in committee discussion about its merits, but sure. Probably boring. I hope you get it, I said, meaning it honestly. Despite everything, I did want his project to succeed. The technology was good. The work was meaningful. Simon might be terrible at seeing me as a complete human being, but his professional competence wasn't the issue. The issue was that he'd never once considered that his wife might be involved in the decision that was keeping him up at night. 3 days later, Simon came home electric with excitement. We got it, he announced, sweeping into the kitchen where I was preparing dinner. The grant came through. $500,000. Martin is thrilled. This is going to completely change my trajectory at Meridian. That's wonderful, I said. Congratulations. He pulled me into a hug, actually lifting me off the ground for a moment. This was Simon at his best, genuinely happy, unguarded, present. For a moment, I remembered why I'd fallen in love with him. I have to take Martin and the team out to celebrate, he said. Tomorrow night, probably. You don't mind, do you? Of course not. You wouldn't really enjoy it anyway. It'll be all shop talk about the project. Technical stuff. Technical stuff that I'd reviewed in more depth than anyone at Meridian had, but sure. He kissed my forehead like I was a child he was proud of for understanding. Thanks for being so supportive, Ev. I know my work stuff isn't really your world, but it means a lot that you're interested. Not my world. I'd literally voted on whether his project would exist. That night, lying awake again, I made another decision. I was going to let this play out. I was going to stay in my role on the committee, continuing to oversee Meridian's grant compliance. And I was going to wait. Eventually, Simon would push too far. He'd dismiss me one too many times in front of the wrong people, or he'd make one too many jokes about my simple career, and when that moment came, I'd be ready. I had all the power. I just needed the perfect moment to use it. The success of the grant changed Simon. Or maybe it just revealed who he'd always been, now that he had something concrete to feel superior about. Within 2 weeks of the funding announcement, he was promoted to Senior Project Director. Martin Arquette made a big show of it at a department meeting, I know this because Simon recorded it on his phone and played it for me that evening, narrating over Martin's speech to explain context I apparently couldn't grasp on my own. This is a really big deal in corporate structure, Simon explained as we watched Martin shake his hand on the small screen. Senior project director means I'm basically running the entire initiative. I have 3 analysts reporting to me now, plus contractors. This is the kind of title people spend 10 years working toward. I'm proud of you, I said, and I meant it. Whatever else was true, Simon had worked hard for this. Martin says if this project succeeds, when it succeeds, I'm looking at VP track within 2 years. Vice President, Ev. Before I'm 35. He talked about it constantly. At dinner, he'd explain the technical challenges he was solving, walking me through problems like I was a student who needed remedial education. When friends came over, he'd steer every conversation back to the project, the timeline, the stakes, his leadership strategy. What he never mentioned was where the funding had come from. The Thornton Foundation appeared nowhere in his narrative. The grant was just something that had happened, like good weather or lucky timing, not the result of a rigorous review process that I'd been intimately involved in. 2 months into the project, Thornton required the first quarterly compliance review. All major grants had them, standard practice to ensure recipients were meeting milestones and using funds appropriately. I was assigned as the primary reviewer for Meridian's grant, which made sense since I'd done the initial assessment. I sent Simon's team the compliance requirements via email. Standard forms, budget documentation, progress reports against stated objectives. The email came from my official Thornton Foundation address, evelyn.green@thorntonfoundation.org. My title was in the signature line, Director, Strategic Resource Allocation. Simon's project coordinator, a young analyst named Nico Chen, responded within 2 hours with all the requested documentation. Professional, thorough, clearly someone who understood how grant compliance worked. Simon never mentioned receiving anything from Thornton Foundation. Not that evening, not that week. I waited to see if he'd notice my name on the email, notice my title, make any connection at all between his wife and the foundation funding his career-defining project. Nothing. The compliance review showed the project was progressing well. They were on timeline, on budget, meeting their technical milestones. I wrote a positive assessment and filed it with the committee. Simon's project was safe for another quarter. At home, Simon's condescension was reaching new levels. He'd started explaining basic business concepts to me at dinner parties, interrupting conversations to make sure I understood terms like stakeholder management or strategic alignment. When my own work came up, which was rare, since I'd mostly stopped mentioning it, he'd smile indulgently and say something about how different foundation work was from real corporate environments. The breaking point started building toward the annual gala. Meridian Industries was a platinum sponsor of the Metropolitan Museum fundraiser, which meant Simon's entire department would be there. Martin Arquette had a table. The CEO would be making remarks. It was exactly the kind of event where Simon could network with executives who'd never normally give him access. "You'll need to get a nice dress," Simon told me 3 weeks before the event. "Something elegant but understated. This isn't the kind of event where you want to draw attention. Just look polished and professional." "I know how to dress for a gala, Simon." "I know you do, honey. I'm just saying, there will be some really important people there. C-suite executives, board members. I need to make the right impression, and you're part of that impression." Part of his impression. Not a person attending an event, but an accessory to his professional image. The week before the gala, the second quarterly compliance review came due. I sent the same standard email to Nico Chen. Again, Simon never mentioned it. The review showed continued strong progress. I approved it and moved on. 3 days before the gala, Simon came home with a jewelry box. Inside was a simple pearl necklace, pretty, classic, completely safe. "For the event," he said. "I thought it would go well with whatever dress you choose. Nothing too flashy, just elegant." I looked at the pearls, each one perfectly matched and completely anonymous. This was how Simon saw me. Elegant but understated. Present but not noticeable. Ornamental but not threatening. "They're lovely," I said. "Thank you." That night, I pulled out the navy dress I'd already planned to wear. I looked at myself in the mirror wearing Simon's pearls, and I barely recognized the woman looking back. When had I become this person? When had I agreed to retreat so far into the background that my own husband could forget I existed as anything other than a reflection of his success? The gala was in 2 days. Simon had been rehearsing casual remarks about his project, practicing how he described the technical challenges to executives who might ask. He'd made me rehearse my own answers too, short, simple responses about my administrative work that wouldn't bore anyone or make me seem like I was trying to compete with his accomplishments. I'd smiled and practiced my lines like he'd asked. I'd played the role of the supportive wife who knew her place. But I'd also done something else. I'd requested an emergency session with the Thornton Foundation Grants Committee for the Monday morning after the gala. The meeting request was vague, just a note that I needed to discuss compliance concerns with an active grant. Savannah had approved it immediately. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Simon thought Saturday night was going to be his triumph. His moment to shine in front of the executives who'd decide his future. He had no idea it was going to be the last night of his career as he knew it. We arrived at the Ashford Hotel at 7:30. The grand ballroom was already filling with the kind of people who considered $1,000-a-plate charity dinners a regular Tuesday. Crystal chandeliers, ice sculptures, waiters circulating with champagne that probably cost more per bottle than my monthly car payment. Simon's hand was on my lower back, guiding me through the crowd like I might get lost without his direction. He was wearing his best suit, the charcoal Tom Ford he'd bought specifically for events like this, and he looked good. Confident. Like he belonged here. "There's Martin," he said, steering me toward table 12. "Remember, just smile and be pleasant. Don't try to engage too much in the business discussions. These people appreciate wives who know how to be supportive without dominating the conversation." I'd heard this speech before. Be pleasant. Be supportive. Be quiet. Martin Arquette stood as we approached, shaking Simon's hand with the hearty enthusiasm of a man who'd had a head start on the champagne. "Simon. And this must be Evelyn. I've heard so much about you." "All good things, I hope," I said, the standard response. "Simon tells me you work in administration," Martin continued. "Foundation work, is that right? Very noble. We need people who are good at keeping organizations running smoothly." Simon jumped in before I could respond. "Evelyn's great at details. Very organized. I keep telling her she should apply those skills to something more ambitious, but she's comfortable where she is. Comfortable where I was. Managing a $200 million annual grant portfolio, but sure. Comfortable." The table filled up over the next 20 minutes. There was Chelsea Simmons from Meridian's Investor Relations, mid-40s, sharp suit, sharper eyes. Kyle Monroe from Operations, who spent 10 minutes explaining to me how supply chains worked like I'd never encountered the concept before. A woman named Arden Reeves from the legal department who seemed kind but distracted. And 2 couples I didn't catch the names of, clearly major donors based on how everyone deferred to them. Dinner was served. Salmon or beef, both prepared with the kind of fussy garnishes that marked expensive catering. Simon ordered wine for the table without asking anyone's preference. He was in his element, holding court, telling stories about project challenges and strategic pivots. I ate quietly, responding when spoken to, playing my assigned role. The speeches started during dessert. The museum director thanked everyone for their support. A board member talked about the importance of arts funding. Then the CEO of Meridian Industries, a man named Richard Garrett who I'd only ever seen in LinkedIn photos, stood up to talk about corporate responsibility and community partnership. "We're proud to support institutions that enrich our city," Garrett said. "And we're especially proud of our team members who bring innovation and excellence to everything they do." That was Simon's cue. Martin must have arranged it in advance, because Simon stood smoothly like he'd been expecting it. I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who supported our supply chain optimization project, Simon began, his voice carrying that practiced casual confidence. It's been an incredible journey, and we're seeing results that exceed even our optimistic projections. People at neighboring tables were turning to listen. Simon was good at this, at capturing attention, at making his achievements sound both impressive and effortless. I also want to thank my beautiful wife, Evelyn, he continued, and my stomach tightened because I could hear where this was going. She's been so supportive, even though she doesn't really understand what I do. Her job is in, what do you call it, honey? Administrative operations? The table chuckled politely. I felt Chelsea Simmons glance at me with something that might have been sympathy. She makes sure people have the right paperwork, Simon said, warming up now. Very important work, obviously. Someone has to make sure the forms are filled out correctly. More laughter. Martin was grinning. Kyle Monroe was nodding like Simon was making an excellent point about division of labor. I took a sip of wine. Stayed calm. Let him continue. The thing about Evelyn's job is that it's perfect for her, Simon said, his voice getting louder, more expansive. No real pressure, no major decisions, just making sure things run smoothly in the background. Not everyone can handle high-stakes corporate strategy. Some people are just better suited for support roles. Support roles. While I sat on the committee that had approved his $500,000 grant. There's no shame in having a simpler career path, Simon continued. He actually patted my shoulder. In front of 300 people. Not everyone needs to be in the boardroom making million-dollar decisions. Right, honey? The table was fully engaged now. This was entertainment for them, watching Simon perform affectionate condescension, watching me accept it with gracious humility. I looked up at him. Smiled. The same smile I'd been giving him for 3 years. You're right, I said, my voice quiet but clear. Not everyone can handle that kind of responsibility. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the folded papers I'd been carrying all evening. I'd printed them that afternoon, the grant approval documentation with my signature, the compliance reviews with my assessments, the committee notes with my recommendations. I slid them across the table toward Simon. His smile faltered. What's this? Open it, I said. The table went quiet. Simon picked up the papers with hands that suddenly weren't quite steady. His eyes scanned the first page, the official Thornton Foundation letterhead, the grant approval dated 8 months ago, my name listed as primary reviewer. The exact moment comprehension hit, his face drained of color. The papers shook slightly in his hands. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. I let the silence stretch. Let everyone at the table lean forward, trying to understand what could possibly be written on those pages that would create such a dramatic reaction. Let the tension build until it felt almost unbearable. Then I spoke, pitching my voice to carry clearly across our table and to the neighboring diners who had stopped pretending not to listen. I'm the Director of Strategic Resource Allocation for the Thornton Foundation, I said. I was the primary reviewer for your grant application. I presented your proposal to the committee. I conducted both quarterly compliance reviews. Every report you've submitted has crossed my desk. And last week, I recommended approval of your continued funding for the next quarter. Simon's mouth opened but no words came out. That $500,000 you've been using to build your career? I continued. I approved it. The project you've been calling your greatest professional achievement? I made it possible. All those forms you think I file? They include the ones that determine whether your project continues or gets shut down. Martin Arquette had gone completely still. Chelsea Simmons was staring at me like I'd just announced I was secretly royalty. Kyle Monroe looked like he was trying to solve a complex equation in his head. But you work in admin, Simon managed to say, his voice cracking slightly. No, Simon. You've been telling people I work in admin because it was easier than acknowledging what I actually do. You never asked. In 3 years of marriage, you never once asked me to explain my job in detail. You never wondered what strategic resource allocation meant. You never questioned why I was in meetings until 8 p.m. or why I traveled to site visits or why I brought home documents marked confidential. I stood up, smoothing my navy dress. The emergency committee meeting I've called for Monday morning? That's to discuss whether Meridian's grant should be suspended pending a comprehensive review of project management and organizational culture. I'm specifically concerned about whether the leadership demonstrates the collaborative values and respect for diverse expertise that Thornton Foundation requires from our grant recipients. Simon was still holding the papers, staring at them like they might change if he looked hard enough. Enjoy the rest of your evening, I said. Someone from Thornton will be in touch Monday with next steps. I picked up my clutch and walked toward the exit, my heels clicking on the marble floor. Behind me, I heard the table erupt into chaos. I made it to the lobby before my hands started shaking. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was draining away, replaced by something that felt like shock at what I'd just done. I just publicly humiliated my husband and threatened his career in front of his boss, his colleagues, and half the business community. I stood by the coat check, trying to steady my breathing, when my phone started buzzing in my clutch. Simon. I declined the call. It buzzed again immediately. Simon again. Declined. A text, Evelyn, what the hell are you doing? Another, you need to come back here right now. Another, we need to talk about this. I turned off my phone and handed my ticket to the coat check attendant. She retrieved my wrap without seeming to notice that my hands were trembling as I took it from her. The November air outside was sharp and cold. I stood on the hotel steps, watching taxis pull up to collect other guests who were leaving early. Behind me, through the glass doors, I could see people still milling around the ballroom entrance. Someone was probably already posting about what happened on social media. By tomorrow, this would be everywhere. I ordered a car and waited, pulling my wrap tighter against the wind. The drive home took 20 minutes through downtown traffic. I sat in the back seat, watching the city lights blur past, and tried to process what I'd done. There was no taking it back now. I'd revealed my position publicly, threatened Simon's funding, and made it clear that our entire marriage had been built on his fundamental misunderstanding of who I was. Our apartment was in a converted warehouse building in the Arts District, exposed brick, floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of place that looked impressive in photos but always felt slightly cold. Simon had chosen it because it was close to Meridian's headquarters and projected the right image for a rising executive. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the living room, waiting. The phone I'd turned back on showed 43 missed calls. 17 from Simon. 8 from numbers I didn't recognize. 6 from Martin Arquette. 3 from a number that turned out to be Chelsea Simmons when I checked the voicemail. Evelyn, it's Chelsea from Meridian. I just want to say. I had no idea. None of us did. Simon never mentioned what you actually did. I feel terrible about laughing earlier. If you're willing to talk, I'd really like to understand what happened tonight. I deleted the message halfway through. The voicemail from Martin was less conciliatory. Ms. Green, we need to discuss this situation immediately. What you did tonight was highly inappropriate and potentially damaging to Meridian's reputation. I've consulted with our legal team and we believe there are serious ethical violations in how you've handled this grant oversight given your personal relationship with the project director. You'll be hearing from our attorneys. I'd expected that. May Simmons, Thornton's legal counsel, had already prepared our response to exactly this argument. I'd disclosed the conflict of interest properly. I'd abstained from the approval vote. I'd followed every protocol. If Meridian wanted to fight this on ethics grounds, they'd lose. The texts from Simon kept coming. You're being irrational. This is my career. How could you do this to me? Everyone is staring at me. Martin is furious. You need to fix this now. Call me back immediately. I turned the phone to silent and set it face down on the coffee table. Around midnight, I heard keys in the door. Simon came in looking like he'd aged 5 years in 4 hours. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled in a way that suggested he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. His eyes were red. "What the hell was that?" he said without preamble. Not angry exactly, but something rawer than anger. Betrayal, maybe. Confusion. That was me telling the truth about my job. "You humiliated me. In front of everyone. Martin, the CEO, our biggest clients, everyone saw you make me look like an idiot." "I made you look like what you are," I said quietly. "Someone who spent 3 years underestimating his wife because it was more comfortable than acknowledging her actual capabilities. You could have told me. Any time in the past 8 months, you could have mentioned that you were reviewing my grant application. That you were on the committee. That you had any involvement at all. I tried to talk to you about my work hundreds of times, Simon. You weren't interested. You cut me off, you changed the subject, you explained things to me that I already understood because you assumed I couldn't possibly know anything about business or strategy or finance." He paced across the living room, his movements sharp and agitated. "This is different and you know it. This was my project. My career. You had a responsibility to tell me. I had a responsibility to disclose the conflict of interest to my committee, which I did. I had a responsibility to evaluate your proposal fairly, which I did. I abstained from the final vote. I followed every ethical protocol. What I didn't have was a responsibility to inform you that your wife wasn't actually working in admin, just because that was easier for your ego. Don't turn this into some feminist statement about respect. You sabotaged my career because I made some jokes at a dinner. I approved your grant." My voice came out louder than I intended. 8 months ago, when I could have tanked your entire project with one vote, I gave you my professional assessment and supported your approval. I've conducted 2 compliance reviews and reported that your work was excellent. I recommended continued funding last week. I haven't sabotaged anything. I've been protecting your career while you publicly mocked mine." Simon stopped pacing. "So what happens now? You called an emergency meeting for Monday. What are you planning to do?" "I'm planning to present the facts to the committee. That the project director has demonstrated a pattern of diminishing and dismissing expertise he doesn't personally value. That he's created a hostile environment for his spouse who happens to work in grant oversight. And that I can no longer serve as the primary reviewer for this grant because the conflict of interest has become untenable. You're going to get me fired. I'm going to recuse myself from your grant oversight and let the committee assign someone else. What happens after that depends on your project's merits and Meridian's response to the situation." He stared at me. "I don't even know who you are." "No," I agreed. "You don't. You never bothered to find out." He left. Not permanently. He packed a bag and said he was staying at a hotel for a few days while we figured this out, but when the door closed behind him, the apartment felt emptier than it ever had. I sat in the silence and wondered if I'd just destroyed my marriage to make a point about professional respect. My phone buzzed one more time. A text from Savannah Powell. "I assume Monday's meeting is about Meridian. I'll have the full committee there. Also, I'm proud of you." I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Relief washed over me. Someone understood. I arrived at Thornton Foundation headquarters 40 minutes early Monday morning. The building was mostly empty, just security and a few dedicated early arrivals who liked working before the phone started ringing. I went straight to my office and reviewed my presentation one final time. The emergency committee meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. in conference room 4B. The same room where we'd approved Simon's grant 8 months ago. The symmetry felt intentional, though I hadn't consciously planned it that way. By 8:50, all 11 committee members had arrived. Savannah took her usual seat at the head of the table. May Simmons, our legal counsel, sat to her right, her presence signaling that this wasn't just a routine review. The others arranged themselves around the table with coffee and notepads, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," I began once Savannah nodded for me to start. "I've called this meeting to address a significant conflict of interest that's developed with the Meridian Industries grant." I pulled up my presentation on the conference room screen. The first slide showed the basic facts: grant amount, project timeline, current status. As you know, I disclosed 8 months ago that my husband Simon Green is the project director for this grant. I abstained from the approval vote and you determined that I could remain involved in compliance oversight with appropriate boundaries. Heads nodded around the table. This was all in the record. Saturday night, at a public event attended by Meridian executives and approximately 300 community members, my husband made extensive remarks about my professional capabilities, or his perception of my lack thereof. He characterized my work here as administrative operations, paperwork, and support roles that require no real decision-making authority. I clicked to the next slide, which showed direct quotes from Simon's speech. I'd reconstructed them from memory, and they looked even worse written out than they'd sounded in the moment. He made these remarks while celebrating the success of a project that I personally reviewed, assessed, and recommended for approval. A project I've overseen through 2 compliance reviews. A project that exists because of a grant process he apparently believes I'm not qualified to understand. Jacob Powell, who handled financial reviews, leaned forward. Did he know you were involved in his grant approval? No. Despite multiple opportunities over 8 months to mention that his career-defining project was funded by a foundation grant, he never told me about the application. And when I tried to discuss my work here, he consistently dismissed it as too complex or too boring for me to meaningfully engage with. So he humiliated you publicly while being completely ignorant of your actual role in his success, Savannah said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Mae Simmons cleared her throat. I should note that we've received communication from Meridian's legal team. They're arguing that Evelyn's continued involvement in grant oversight constitutes a conflict of interest that invalidates the entire grant process. They're suggesting bias in the approval and threatening to escalate to the state attorney general's office. A few committee members shifted uncomfortably. This was exactly the kind of legal complication that could damage the foundation's reputation. Walk us through the timeline, Savannah said. Every disclosure, every decision point, every procedural step. I did. I showed them the email I'd sent disclosing the conflict before the initial review. The committee minutes showing my abstention from the approval vote. The compliance review reports where I documented both positive findings and areas for improvement without bias in either direction. The secondary reviews conducted by other staff members that confirmed my assessments. At every stage, I followed protocol, I concluded. The conflict of interest was disclosed and managed appropriately. Meridian's legal argument has no merit. Agreed, Mae said. But that doesn't solve the current problem. Your husband now knows you've been overseeing his grant. The relationship has become hostile. You can't continue as primary reviewer under these circumstances. I know, I said. I'm formally requesting to be removed from any oversight role for the Meridian grant. I'm recommending that Jacob take over as primary reviewer, with Arden providing secondary assessment. Jacob nodded. I can do that. I've been following the project peripherally anyway. There's a bigger question here, said a committee member named Marcus Reed, who handled strategic partnerships. Does Meridian's organizational culture align with Thornton's values? If their project director publicly demonstrates this level of dismissiveness toward professional expertise, particularly toward a woman in a leadership role, what does that say about how they operate internally? This was the question I'd been hoping someone would raise. That's exactly my concern, I said. Grant recipients are expected to demonstrate collaborative leadership, respect for diverse expertise, and inclusive practices. Simon's behavior Saturday night suggests that Meridian may not be fostering that kind of environment. Savannah looked around the table. Thoughts? I think we need a comprehensive organizational culture review, said Arden Reeves, the lawyer. Not just of Simon's project team, but of Meridian's broader leadership practices. Interview employees, review HR policies, assess their diversity and inclusion metrics. That's a significant escalation, Jacob pointed out. It could damage our relationship with Meridian as a grant recipient. It could also identify serious problems before we invest any more money in them, Marcus countered. We've funded them for 8 months. We have a responsibility to ensure our grants support organizations that reflect our values. The discussion continued for another 30 minutes. Various approaches were debated: immediate suspension, continued funding with additional oversight, mandatory organizational review, probationary status. Finally, Savannah called for a consensus decision. Jacob will take over as primary reviewer effective immediately, she announced. Evelyn is fully recused from any Meridian-related decisions. The grant will continue on its current timeline, but we're implementing a mandatory organizational culture assessment to be completed within 60 days. If that assessment reveals systemic issues with leadership practices or workplace culture, we'll revisit the grant terms at that time. It was a measured response. Not the immediate suspension I'd half expected, but not a simple reassignment either. Meridian would be under scrutiny, and they'd know it. Evelyn, Savannah said as people started gathering their materials to leave, I want to note for the record that your handling of this situation has been impeccable. You disclosed properly, you followed protocol, and you recused yourself at the appropriate time. Whatever Meridian's lawyers claim, this committee stands behind your professionalism completely. Several other members nodded in agreement. May Simmons gave me a small smile. I left the meeting feeling something I hadn't expected: vindication. Not because Simon was being punished, the grant was continuing, his project was safe, but because my professional judgment had been validated by people who actually understood what I did. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Simon. One voicemail that just said, "We need to talk about what you're doing to my career." I didn't call back. Instead, I went to my office and started drafting the transition memo that would hand Simon's grant oversight to Jacob. Professional, thorough, completely devoid of personal emotion. By the time I finished, it was nearly noon. I looked out my window at the city below and realized something had fundamentally shifted. I wasn't Simon's wife who happened to have a job anymore. I was Evelyn Green, Director of Strategic Resource Allocation, who happened to be married to someone who'd never bothered to learn who she was. And that marriage, I was starting to realize, might not survive the weekend. Simon showed up at my office Wednesday afternoon. I was reviewing a grant proposal from a biotech startup when David knocked and said, "Your husband is here. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's urgent." I could have refused to see him. Should have, probably. But part of me wanted this conversation to happen here, in my professional environment, where Simon would have to confront exactly who I was in this space. Send him in. Simon entered looking like he hadn't slept since Saturday. His shirt was wrinkled, unusual for him, and he had the kind of shadow on his jaw that suggested he'd skipped shaving that morning. He stood in my doorway taking in my office like he'd never seen it before. He hadn't, actually. In 3 years of marriage, he'd never once visited me at work. "This is where you work," he said, his voice flat. "Yes." He looked at the diplomas on my wall: MBA from Cornell, undergraduate degree from Georgetown. The awards from various professional organizations. The bookshelf filled with grant management texts, strategic planning frameworks, nonprofit governance guides. Evidence of a career he'd never bothered to understand. "Martin put me on administrative leave," he said finally. "Pending the outcome of Thornton's organizational review. They're saying it's voluntary, but we both know what it means. I've been removed from the project I've spent 8 months building." "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "I never wanted that to happen." "Didn't you?" He moved further into the office but didn't sit. "You called an emergency meeting. You triggered a review that you knew would have consequences. Don't pretend this outcome surprises you." I triggered a review because grant recipients are expected to meet certain standards of organizational culture and leadership. What happened Saturday night raised legitimate questions about whether Meridian meets those standards. "Legitimate questions," he repeated bitterly. "I made some jokes at a dinner, Evelyn." "Stupid jokes, yes. Insensitive, sure. But you're destroying my career over it. You spent 3 years telling everyone I was incompetent. 3 years dismissing everything I accomplished professionally. 3 years explaining basic business concepts to me like I was a child while I was actually making decisions about millions of dollars in funding. Saturday night wasn't an isolated incident, Simon. It was the culmination of a pattern." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller, more uncertain. I didn't think you minded. What? The way I talked about your job. I thought you were okay with it. You never corrected me. You never insisted on explaining what you actually did. You just went along with it. I stared at him. I corrected you dozens of times in the first year of our marriage. Every time you called my work administrative, every time you said I did paperwork, every time you told people I had a simple job. You ignored every correction and kept saying whatever was most convenient for your narrative. I don't remember that. I know you don't. That's the problem. You weren't listening. You never listened when I talked about my work because you'd already decided it wasn't important enough to pay attention to. Simon finally sat down in one of the chairs across from my desk. He looked defeated in a way I'd never seen him look before. Meridian's legal team thinks we should sue Thornton for improper grant management. They want to argue that you had a vendetta against me and used your position to retaliate. Do you believe that? He was quiet. I don't know what to believe anymore. I thought I knew you, Evelyn. I thought we had a good marriage. I thought you were happy. I was erased, I said quietly. You erased me because visible wives with impressive careers are harder to manage than supportive wives who stay in the background. And I let you do it because at a certain point it seemed easier than fighting to be seen. So this is what? Revenge for being underestimated? This is me refusing to be erased anymore. Even if that means our marriage ends. Even if that means your project faces scrutiny. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being someone's ornamental accessory who pretends not to understand the world she actually helps run. Simon rubbed his face with both hands. Martin says I need to decide whether to fight this or accept that my career at Meridian is effectively over. The organizational review is going to interview my team, my colleagues, people who've worked with me for years. They're going to ask questions about how I treat people, how I talk about women in leadership, how I respond to expertise I don't personally possess. And the thing is, Evelyn, I don't know what they're going to find. That admission surprised me. Some self-awareness breaking through the denial. I think I've been an asshole, he continued. Not just to you. To a lot of people. I think I've spent my entire career so focused on climbing the ladder and proving myself that I never stopped to consider whether I was actually good at treating people with respect. And now it's all falling apart, and I can't even argue that I don't deserve it. I didn't know what to say to that. This was the most honest Simon had been with me in years, maybe ever. The lawyers want me to paint you as vindictive, he said. As a spurned wife who couldn't handle her husband's success, so she sabotaged his career. They've drafted a statement about how you violated ethical boundaries and manipulated the grant process to hurt me. Are you going to let them use it? He looked at me directly for the first time since entering my office. No. Because it's not true. You followed every rule. You disclosed everything you were supposed to disclose. You gave my project a fair evaluation and approved it even though I'd spent months treating you like you were too stupid to understand basic concepts. And then I stood up in front of 300 people and humiliated you, and you still didn't revoke my funding. You just stepped away so someone else could make decisions without any conflict of interest. So what are you going to do? I'm going to resign from Meridian before they fire me. I'm going to tell Martin that the organizational review will find exactly what it's looking for, evidence that I've created a toxic environment through my own arrogance and dismissiveness. And then I'm going to figure out who I am when I'm not the rising star project director with the supportive wife who knows her place. He stood up to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, I really did think your work wasn't as important as mine. I believed it. I convinced myself that what I was doing mattered more because it was more visible, more celebrated, more clearly impressive. And I never questioned that belief because questioning it would have meant admitting that I'd married someone more accomplished than me. Someone I should have been learning from instead of condescending to. Simon. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking you to take me back or save my career or pretend this didn't happen. I'm just acknowledging, finally, that you were right. About everything. He paused, his voice quieter now. I know this sounds like a convenient realization now that I've lost everything. Maybe it is. But my therapist has been pulling this out of me for weeks, making me see patterns I've spent my whole life refusing to acknowledge. And I'm sorry it took me losing everything to finally understand. After he left, I sat in my office for a long time, watching the city through my window and trying to process what had just happened. Simon's admission didn't fix anything. It didn't undo 3 years of dismissal or erase the humiliation of Saturday night. But it was something. A recognition that I'd been right to refuse to stay erased. My phone buzzed with an email from Jacob. The Meridian organizational review had begun. The first interviews were scheduled for Friday. Martin Arquette had called to complain about the scope of the questions, but Jacob had held firm on the assessment criteria. Whatever happened next with Simon, with our marriage, with his career, that was secondary now. What mattered was that I'd finally refused to diminish myself. And I wasn't going to apologize for it. Winter settled over the city with the kind of cold that made everything feel sharper, more defined. I stood in my new apartment, a one-bedroom in a historic building near the park, nothing like the converted warehouse Simon and I had shared, and watched snow fall past my window while my coffee went cold on the counter. The divorce papers had been filed 6 weeks ago. Simon signed them without contest, which surprised me less than it might have 3 months earlier. We'd agreed to mediation rather than litigation, splitting assets with the kind of clinical efficiency that suggested neither of us had the energy to fight over furniture and retirement accounts. He'd taken the warehouse apartment. I'd taken the freedom. The organizational review of Meridian had concluded in late December with findings that surprised no one who'd been paying attention. The review documented a pattern of dismissive behavior toward women in technical and leadership roles, a culture that rewarded aggressive self-promotion over collaborative achievement, and what the report termed systematic devaluation of expertise that didn't conform to traditional masculine performance. Simon's resignation had come before the report was finalized, but it didn't spare him from being named specifically in the findings. Martin Arquette had also resigned, whether voluntarily or under pressure, the official statements didn't say. 3 other senior executives had been placed on performance improvement plans. The Meridian grant had been suspended in January. Not cancelled entirely, but put on hold pending implementation of mandatory workplace culture reforms and new leadership oversight. Jacob was handling the negotiations about what those reforms needed to look like. I was grateful to be completely removed from any of those decisions. My phone rang. Savannah Powell calling. Good morning, I answered. Evelyn. How are you settling into the new place? It's good. Quiet. Smaller than I'm used to, but that's not a bad thing. I'm calling because I want to discuss something with you. The board met yesterday and we talked about the Meridian situation, the review process, everything that's happened over the past few months. I felt my stomach tighten. This was it, the conversation where they'd tell me that despite following protocol, despite doing everything right, my judgment had been compromised by personal circumstances and perhaps I should consider stepping back from grant oversight entirely. The board wants to promote you, Savannah said. I nearly dropped my coffee mug. What? We're creating a new position, Vice President of Grant Integrity and Organizational Standards. Essentially, you'd be responsible for developing frameworks to assess not just the technical merit of grant proposals, but the organizational culture and leadership practices of applicants. Making sure we're funding organizations that align with our values around inclusive leadership, collaborative practices, respect for diverse expertise. That's a significant expansion of scope. It is. And it's needed. What happened with Meridian exposed a gap in our review process. We were so focused on technical capability and financial stability that we weren't adequately assessing whether organizations actually practiced the values they claimed to support. You identified that gap and had the courage to act on it even when it cost you personally. I walked to my window, looking out at the snow-covered park. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. The role would come with a substantial salary increase, a seat on the executive leadership team, and authority to shape policy across the entire foundation. It's a big job, Evelyn. But I think you're exactly the person we need in it. After we hung up, I sat with the offer for a long time. This was what visibility looked like, not just being seen, but being valued for what you saw. Being given authority that matched your expertise. Being trusted to build something new because you'd proven you understood what needed to change. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me check. "Hi Evelyn, this is Nico Chen from Meridian. I was on Simon's project team. I wanted you to know that several of us spoke honestly during the organizational review about the culture problems we'd observed. What you did at that gala, it gave us permission to finally say what we'd been seeing for months. Thank you for that." I stared at the message for a long moment before typing a response. Thank you for having the courage to speak up. That takes real strength. Another text came through, this time from Chelsea Simmons. Just heard about your promotion. Congratulations. You deserved recognition years ago, but better late than never. Would love to grab coffee sometime if you're open to it. Over the next few days, similar messages arrived from unexpected sources. A woman who worked in Meridian's legal department thanked me for modeling what it looks like to refuse to shrink. A former colleague from my data analytics days reached out to say she'd followed the news coverage and felt inspired to push back on similar dismissal in her own workplace. Even my sister called, we hadn't spoken in months, to say she'd been reading articles about the situation and wanted me to know she was proud of how I'd handled it. The story had become bigger than just my marriage or Simon's career. It had somehow touched something that resonated with people who'd experienced their own versions of being overlooked, of having their expertise dismissed, of being told they were too sensitive when they objected to being diminished. I met with Savannah the following week to accept the VP position. We discussed the scope, the timeline for transition, the resources I'd need to build out the new frameworks. She was enthusiastic in a way that made me realize how long she'd been waiting for someone to take on this work. "One more thing," Savannah said as I was leaving her office. "The New York Times is doing a feature on workplace culture and grant funding accountability. They want to interview you. No obligation to participate, but I think you should consider it. Your story matters beyond just our foundation." I thought about it for 2 days before agreeing. The interview happened in a coffee shop near my new apartment. The journalist was a woman in her 40s named Rachel Whitmore who'd been covering workplace culture issues for years. "What made you decide to act when you did?" she asked after we'd covered the basic timeline. "I realized I'd been complicit in my own erasure," I said. "I'd let Simon diminish me because confronting it felt harder than accepting it. But there's a point where acceptance becomes permission, and permission becomes participation in your own diminishment. That gala was the moment I decided I'd rather blow up my life than continue participating in that dynamic." "Do you regret it?" I thought about Simon's face when he realized who I actually was. The committee's support when I called the emergency meeting. The messages from strangers who said my story had given them courage. The VP offer that would let me build something meaningful. "No," I said. "I regret waiting as long as I did." The article ran 3 weeks later with the headline, "The Hidden Cost of Being Underestimated, How One Woman's Grant Approval Exposed Her Husband's Career, and Her Own Expertise." It went viral almost immediately, sparking conversations about workplace dynamics, marital power imbalances, and the ways women in technical and leadership roles are systematically dismissed. I didn't read most of the commentary. Some of it was supportive, some was critical, all of it was noise that didn't really matter compared to the work I was actually doing. By March, I'd hired 2 analysts to help develop the new organizational culture assessment frameworks. We were building rubrics for evaluating leadership practices, creating interview protocols to assess workplace environment, designing metrics that would help us identify organizations where values aligned with actual practice. It was the most meaningful work I'd ever done. Not just because it was challenging, but because it emerged directly from my own experience of being overlooked and choosing to become visible again. I ran into Simon on a Tuesday in April at a coffee shop 3 blocks from my apartment. I'd stopped in for my usual mid-morning cappuccino, lost in thought about a grant proposal I was reviewing, when I heard a familiar voice ordering at the counter. He looked different. Not worse exactly, but softer somehow. He was wearing jeans and a sweater instead of his usual business attire, and his hair was slightly longer than he used to keep it. When he turned with his coffee and saw me, his expression cycled through surprise, uncertainty, and something that might have been relief. "Evelyn," he said. "Hi. Simon." I gestured to the empty chair at my table. "Do you want to sit?" He hesitated, then nodded. We sat in awkward silence for a moment, two people who'd shared 3 years of marriage and now barely knew how to start a conversation. "I heard about your promotion," he said finally. "Congratulations. Vice President. That's significant." "Thank you. How are you doing?" "I'm consulting. Technology implementation strategy for small businesses. Nothing glamorous, but it's honest work. And I'm good at it, actually, when I'm not trying to impress anyone or climb some imaginary ladder." He looked at his coffee cup, turning it slowly in his hands. "I've been in therapy since January. Trying to understand why I spent so much of my life performing success instead of actually building anything meaningful." "That's good," I said, meaning it. "That takes courage. I've been thinking a lot about that night at the gala. What I said about you, about your work. I knew it was wrong even as I was saying it, you know? Some part of me knew I was being cruel. But everyone was laughing and I felt so powerful. Like I was finally someone who mattered." "You did matter, Simon. You just thought you could only matter if I didn't." He nodded slowly. "My therapist says I have a pattern of building myself up by diminishing others. She says it probably goes back to my father, to never feeling like I was good enough unless I could point to someone who was less than me. Not an excuse, just trying to understand it." "Understanding is important," I said. "It doesn't undo what happened, but it matters." "The Meridian project finally got funding again," he said. "Different leadership, new oversight, but the technology was sound. I heard they're actually ahead of schedule now. I'm glad. It was always a good project. Built on a foundation you created." He met my eyes. "I've been wanting to say this for months. Thank you for approving that grant. Thank you for seeing the merit in the work even when I couldn't see the merit in yours. You could have destroyed that project out of spite and you would have been justified. But you didn't. You evaluated it fairly and gave it a chance. That's more grace than I deserved." I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of it. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because the project met our standards and would create value. That's what professional integrity looks like, making decisions based on merit, not personal feelings." "I know. That's what makes it meaningful." He stood to leave, then paused. "I saw the Times article. The one about your work on organizational culture standards. You're building something important, Evelyn. Something that will help a lot of people who've been overlooked the way I overlooked you. I'm proud of you, even though I have no right to be. Simon. I'm not asking for anything. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not even friendship. I just wanted you to know that I finally see you. All of you. And what I see is someone extraordinary who I was too insecure to recognize when I had the chance." He walked toward the door, then turned back one more time. "For what it's worth, I hope you find someone who sees you from the beginning. Who celebrates your success instead of feeling threatened by it. You deserve that." After he left, I sat with my cappuccino and watched spring rain start to fall outside the window. Simon's words had been genuine. I could tell the difference now between performed remorse and actual growth. He was becoming someone different, someone who might actually be capable of healthy relationships built on mutual respect rather than hierarchical diminishment. But that person wasn't someone I needed in my life anymore. I'd spent 3 years shrinking myself to fit into his vision of who I should be. Now I was building something bigger, not just the VP role at Thornton, but a whole life where I didn't have to perform smallness to make someone else comfortable. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. I had a meeting in 40 minutes with a potential grant applicant, a women-led biotech startup that was doing groundbreaking work on diagnostic technology. The kind of meeting where I got to ask questions that actually mattered and make decisions that would shape someone's future. I finished my coffee, gathered my things, and walked out into the rain feeling something I hadn't felt in years, completely, authentically myself. The woman I'd been when I married Simon had needed his approval, had believed that being chosen by him meant she was valuable. The woman I'd become didn't need anyone's validation except her own. And that woman had work to do. October arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes everything feel possible. I stood in conference room 4B at Thornton Foundation headquarters, preparing for the annual grant portfolio review presentation. The room was packed, not just our internal committee, but board members, strategic partners, and representatives from organizations we'd funded over the past year. This was the first major presentation in my new role as Vice President of Grant Integrity and Organizational Standards. 6 months of building frameworks, developing assessment tools, and training staff on how to evaluate not just what organizations promised to do, but how they actually operated. The numbers on the screen told a story I was proud of. We'd reviewed 47 major grant applications using the new cultural assessment protocols. We'd approved 31 with full confidence that the organizations demonstrated genuine commitment to inclusive leadership and collaborative practices. We denied 12 where the organizational culture raised red flags despite technically sound proposals. And we'd placed 4 organizations on conditional approval with mandatory culture improvements, including Meridian Industries, which had now successfully completed their requirements and been moved to full approval status. The traditional grant review process focuses almost entirely on technical merit and financial stability, I told the assembled group. What we've proven over the past 6 months is that organizational culture is equally predictive of success. Organizations that genuinely value diverse expertise, that create environments where all team members can contribute meaningfully, consistently outperform those with top-down hierarchical structures that concentrate decision-making power with a small leadership group. I clicked to the next slide showing outcome data. Organizations that had passed our cultural assessment were 34% more likely to meet their project milestones on schedule. They reported 41% higher employee satisfaction scores. And they demonstrated 28% better innovation metrics, more creative solutions, more adaptive problem solving, more breakthrough thinking. Respect for expertise isn't just a nice value to have, I continued. It's a performance multiplier. Organizations that dismiss contributions from people who don't fit traditional leadership profiles are actively undermining their own potential. After the presentation, several board members approached me with questions and congratulations. Savannah pulled me aside with a smile that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment. The board wants to expand your department, she said. 2 additional staff positions, increased budget for assessment tools and training. You've proven the model works. Now we want to scale it. That evening, I returned to my apartment and found myself thinking about the journey that had led here. A year ago, I'd been sitting in this same building reviewing Simon's grant application and wondering whether to tell him I was involved in the process. I'd been retreating into the background, accepting dismissal as the price of maintaining a marriage that was slowly eroding who I was. Now I was building frameworks that would help other people avoid the same trap. Creating systems that would make it harder for talented people to be dismissed simply because they didn't perform their competence in expected ways. My phone buzzed with an email from a woman I didn't know. The subject line read, "Thank you for the Times article." "Dear Ms. Green," it began. "I read your interview 6 months ago about refusing to stay overlooked. At the time, I was in a job where my manager consistently took credit for my work while telling our director that I needed extensive guidance to complete basic tasks. Your story gave me the courage to document everything and request a meeting with HR. Last week, I was promoted to team lead and my former manager was reassigned. I wanted you to know that your willingness to speak publicly about being diminished helped me find my own voice. Thank you." I received messages like this almost weekly now. Women who'd been dismissed in meetings, overlooked for promotions, or had their expertise explained back to them by less qualified colleagues. Each message reminded me that what had felt like a personal crisis, my marriage ending, Simon's humiliation at the gala, had somehow become part of a larger conversation about visibility and value. The story I'd been telling myself for 3 years was that maintaining peace was more important than demanding recognition. That being underestimated was a small price to pay for stability. That my work could speak for itself without me having to advocate for its significance. But work doesn't speak for itself. Competence doesn't automatically generate recognition. Expertise that's performed quietly, in the background, without demanding attention, is expertise that gets credited to whoever speaks loudest about it. I'd learned that the hard way. And now I was using that lesson to build something that might prevent others from having to learn it the same way. I walked to my window and looked out at the city lights spreading toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, Simon was rebuilding his career with what I hoped was genuine humility and self-awareness. Martin Arquette had taken a position at a smaller firm where his outdated leadership style might do less damage. Meridian Industries was slowly transforming under new leadership that actually valued collaborative expertise. And I was here, in an apartment I'd chosen for myself, doing work that mattered in ways I could measure and see. The woman who'd sat silently at that gala while her husband mocked her competence felt like a stranger now. Not because I'd become someone different, but because I'd finally stopped pretending to be someone smaller than I was. Being overlooked had felt like safety for a long time. But visibility, real visibility, where people saw not just your presence but your actual capabilities, that was power. And I was never going back. I pulled out my laptop and started drafting the proposal for expanding the cultural assessment program to mid-sized grants, not just major ones. If we could influence how hundreds of organizations thought about leadership and expertise, we could shift entire sectors toward practices that valued people for what they knew rather than how traditionally they performed that knowledge. It was ambitious. It would take years to fully implement. It would face resistance from organizations that benefited from the old hierarchical models. But I'd already done the hardest part. I'd refused to stay small when staying small was easier. Everything else was just details. The city lights glowed against the October darkness. Tomorrow I had 3 grant reviews, a meeting with potential partner foundations, and a call with a journalist who wanted to discuss our outcomes data. Tomorrow, I would continue building the thing I discovered I was actually good at, creating space for people to be seen for who they really were, not who others needed them to be. And that felt extraordinary. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.